Hi, my name is Deb Disney, and I'm a psychotherapist currently working at Methodist College in Peoria, Illinois. I've worked for hospice, I've worked with foster children, I've worked in the field of oncology, in private practice, and now primarily with college students. And of one thing I'm certain, most people that I have encountered have one thing in common. It seems that most of us crave peace of mind, to be happy, to not suffer. We go about that goal in very different ways, but a factor that unites us in common humanity is our desire to be happy and not suffer. And I'm no different. I also crave peace of mind. I also crave being content and to not suffer. But life happens. Change is inevitable. We get sick, we lose jobs, people we love get sick. People we love lose jobs. Suffering happens. There's a certain amount of inevitable suffering that's a part of this life. But what I now know is that there's a difference between inevitable and optional suffering. When we're sad about somebody being sick, that's inevitable suffering. When we drown in that sadness, that's optional suffering. And what I've come to realize is that I'm no longer willing to drown in optional suffering. And that's what mindfulness meditation has done for me. It's allowed me to more often accept my inevitable suffering and to let go of optional suffering. And I'm certainly not perfect at this yet, but in the years since 2001, which is when I started a daily practice of mindfulness meditation, I've been more able to figure out the difference between the inevitable suffering and the optional suffering. Remember the serenity prayer? Well, just because I have an irreverent sense of humor, let's start with this version of the serenity prayer. Lord, grant me the serenity to accept stupid people the way they are, courage to maintain my self-control, and wisdom to know that if I act on it, I'll go to jail. I hope you're not offended by this. I just thought it was helpful to insert a little humor into a serious topic. So, of course, here is the real one. May I have the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Like I said, I've had a daily mindfulness meditation practice since 2001, and before that, I was on an emotional roller coaster of high highs and low lows, depending on what chaos was going on around me. Today, even in the midst of chaos, I can be on an emotional merry-go-round where I remain fairly even-keeled no matter what life is throwing at me. Have you ever tried to change things that cannot be changed? It's pretty frustrating. Or have you ever not changed things that can be changed? Mindfulness for me has helped me to have more wisdom to accept inevitable suffering, and more wisdom to change optional suffering, and more wisdom to know the difference. So this is a 3-part series. This is the first part, Introduction and Benefits of Mindfulness. The second video will talk about how to do formal mindfulness meditation and how to do informal mindfulness meditation as you go about the tasks of daily living. And then the final video will talk about misconceptions, myths, and where you can find more information. So before I go farther in the mindfulness discussion, let's pause for a second to reiterate that there is indeed a mind-body connection. Deepak Chopra said in one of his books, if you tell somebody they have cancer, not everyone, but most people will start having thoughts about what will this do to their lives, and you can immediately detect chemicals of fear in their bloodstream. And if you were to tell someone that they've won the lottery, not everyone, but most people will start having thoughts about what they'll do with all that money, and you can immediately detect chemicals of pleasure. So there's no doubt that there is a mind-body connection. What happens in our minds will indeed affect our bodies, and we can use this connection to our benefit. So let's see how. So this is a flowchart of human experience. An event happens. We work up a story about that event. Those thoughts cause our body to be flooded with neurochemicals, and we feel the sensations in our bodies. And we usually label those feelings as mad, glad, sad, afraid, guilty, 5 basic feelings. And then we choose a behavior based on that feeling. This process happens so fast, we're usually not aware that all of this is going on. So let me give you an example for myself of road rage. Prior to 2001, when I started mindfulness meditation, I had a bad case of road rage. And it happened so fast, I didn't even know that all of this was going on. So the primary event that would happen is I'd be on a 2-lane road and somebody would pass me and then zip back in front of me just to immediately slow down and turn. That aggravated me to no end. I assumed that that driver made me mad. Well, actually, nobody can make you mad. I know this can be a hard pill to swallow, and it took a while for me to wrap my own brain around it. But emotion is a choice that we make. So now I can look at this flowchart and I realized, okay, the event that happened was kind of an obnoxious driver. My belief was that he was treating me with no respect, that he thought that his need was more important than my need. I had such strong beliefs about that, it immediately flooded my body with neurochemicals of anger, and I felt that physically in my body, and I'm not proud to say it, but the behavior I chose was to flip him off. That is not in line with my personal value of treating people with respect no matter what. One primary benefit of mindfulness meditation is that it opens up a space between the event that happens and the behavior that we choose. Certainly today, these many years that I have been doing mindfulness meditation, that particular event still sometimes happens. But now, instead of me having a knee-jerk reaction to it, I'm aware of my thoughts, and I even am able to consider that there may be some other thoughts, such as maybe he's a firefighter on his way to a fire, maybe he's a hospice worker on his way to the bedside of a dying patient, maybe he truly is just a jerk. But that is more about him than it is about me. So I've changed my relationship to those thoughts, realized that they are just thoughts, and so not as much neurochemical floods my bloodstream, so my feelings are not as intense. I'm still annoyed, but my feelings are not as intense, and from that place I can choose a different behavior, which in this case is just blow it off and not flip him the finger. So my behavior is now more in line with my internally held values. So we're going to talk more in a little bit about how mindfulness helps us to master our stories. And this really is a superpower. It's a very useful skill because we tell ourselves stories to help us make sense of the world. Very natural. That storytelling happens blindingly fast. And if we can control the stories that we tell ourselves, then those stories will not take control of us. We can be more aware of not confusing stories with facts. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So maybe for right now, just think of an example where you were not comfortable with the event that happened. Or maybe you weren't comfortable with your own thoughts and feelings about that event, or your behavior in response to that event. I think that after doing mindfulness meditation for a few weeks, if you were to go back and look at that particular event, you might see yourself viewing it in a whole different light. So the really important point that I want to make before we move on is that it's not what happens to us that causes our distressing feelings. It's what we believe about what happens to us that causes our distressing feelings. And I'm not trying to minimize really difficult things like death, for example, or getting cancer. Of course, those are going to be challenging, but there's some inevitable suffering that happens because of that, and then there's some optional suffering that when we choose the optional suffering, it makes us just drown in the feelings and drown in the drama. So let's talk a little bit more about mastering the stories. This is a diagram of when a story becomes stinkin' thinkin'. It's an analogy of a snowball rolling down the hill. It starts as a small snowball. Perhaps you can think about like if you're a student and you're about to take a test, and the first small thought is, oh my gosh, what if I fail this test? And then the snowball rolls a little bit farther down the hill and gathers more snow. And you think, what if I fail this class? And the snowball rolls a little farther down the hill. What if I fail 2 classes? What if I get kicked out of school? And left to continue down the hill, that snowball will gather so much snow that by the time it's at the bottom, the story is now a catastrophe. Oh my God, I'm going to be homeless. I'm never going to reach my goals. I'm going to be penniless and have no food and have no place to sleep. So this is an example of catastrophic thinking. It's taking one thought and allowing the story to build and build and build so that we get so entangled in the story that it becomes a catastrophic story. And you know, this can happen pretty quickly without us even thinking about it. It's easier to stop a snowball at the top of the hill when it's small than it is to stop it at the bottom of the hill when it's huge. So as thoughts arise, we want to do some thought stopping. Notice I did not say thought squashing. Thought squashing doesn't really work. What you resist persists. If there was a pink elephant in the middle of the room and I said, whatever you do, do not think about that pink elephant, what are you going to think about? The pink elephant. And the more you try not to, the more you do. So telling yourself to squash the thought, to stop thinking those thoughts, tends to not work. Instead, I suggest changing your relationship to those thoughts. And that means to radically accept that they are just thoughts. We tend to give thoughts way more power than they deserve. We don't have to believe every thought that occurs. So thought labeling goes something like this. If the original thought is, what if I fail this test? The labeled thought is, I'm having the thought, what if I fail this test? The original thought invited the entanglement of building a story. The labeled thought allows you to catch it and let it go. And so one way to master stories is to label thoughts as just thoughts before they roll down the hill into stinkin' thinkin'. Another strategy is to realize that thoughts are just thoughts, they're just perceptions, and they're probably never 100% accurate. Have you ever heard the story of the elephant and the blind man? You ask the blind man who's gripping the elephant's tail, "What's an elephant?" And he says, "An elephant is like a rope." Well, he's somewhat right, but not 100% right. And you ask the blind man who's touching the belly, what is an elephant? And he says, an elephant is like a wall. And you ask the blind man who's touching the leg, what is an elephant? And he says, an elephant's like a tree trunk. So again, none of them are wrong, they just aren't 100% right. And our perceptions are almost always based on the limited view of the world we have from where we're currently standing. There is almost always more to the story than what we can see. So why would we allow our thoughts to become the snowball rolling down the hill? So we talked earlier about labeling thoughts as just thoughts. And very helpful to do that because they are never 100% the truth. And another strategy for mastering the stories is to consider approaching life with the beginner's mind, being an observer and not a judger. Think about when a mother takes her children to the art museum and they encounter a painting. She might look at that painting with past stories running through her mind. She might be thinking, I remember reading about this artist in my high school art class. That painting is depicting a Bible story. Oh, I remember my Sunday school teacher telling me about that story. I didn't like that Sunday school teacher. He had wild hair and he smelled bad. So lots of history came to mind. The snowball rolled down the hill, creating a story that pulled her away from the present moment. She was thinking about past things, but she may also get pulled into a storyline of the future. She might think, that painting would look really great in my living room. Well, I'd have to paint the living room a different color. I'll never have the money to buy such a painting. Maybe I could learn to be a painter myself. Oh gosh, I don't have time to do that. I've got children. I really miss having the time to be creative. So again, she got pulled into a storyline, pulled her away from the present moment. But the children, with their beginner minds, might be thinking, wow, look at all of the colors. They are staying in the present moment, not engaging with the story, not allowing the snowball to roll down the hill. So who's more content with the moment? So going back to this flow chart of the human experience, we talked a lot about thoughts. We can't really control what thoughts are going to organically arise, but we can change our relationship to the thoughts. We can change how much power we give to those thoughts. So we talked about labeling thoughts as just thoughts so they don't become the snowball rolling down the hill. Realize that they are just perceptions, our limited view of the elephant being like a tail, and attempt to have thoughts that have the nature of beginner's mind with no judgment. If we can do that, we will have less intense feelings about the situation. So now let's look at the feelings part of this flow chart. I think it could be helpful also to mention that neuroscientists tell us that feelings are simply neurochemicals. So if two people side by side feel afraid, they could be experiencing that in very different ways. Let's say there are two patients side by side who were just told that they have cancer, and both of them, their thoughts are going toward, how is this going to affect my life? And the chemical of fear gets released into their bloodstream. But perhaps one of them has got kind of a queasy stomach because she has cells in her stomach with receptor sites, so the chemical of fear can dock on there. Whereas maybe the other one has tight shoulders because she has cells with receptor sites that allow the chemical of fear to dock on there. So they experience it in very different ways. They experience the fear in very different ways. So once they feel that feeling in their bodies, they feel the cells being affected, that sends another message up to the brain that something's not quite right. And neuroscientists tell us feelings drive all of our behavior, all of our choices, that we could not even choose to brush our teeth in the morning if we did not have a feeling about having clean teeth. Feelings are not our enemy, so we need feelings in order to make choices about behavior. We need fear, or we would play in the traffic. We need anger, or we would still have racial injustice in this country. We just don't need for our feelings to hijack our brains. Normally. There are situations, and we'll talk about that in a second, but normally we don't need for feelings to hijack our brain, but we do need feelings. So the brain functions today pretty much the same as it did thousands of years ago. There's two possible modes. One mode, which you're probably in while watching this video, is that your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right behind your forehead, is probably in charge. It's in charge when you're feeling safe, when you're feeling secure. The other mode of the brain is when the limbic system with the amygdala, which is deep inside of the brain, is like the amygdala is two almond-shaped parts deep inside the brain. This is the emotional seat of the brain. And when it's in charge, we're more in the fight, flight, or freeze mode because we're not feeling safe. So two modes. I have nicknamed these the thinker driver. That's when we're feeling safe and the prefrontal cortex can be in charge, or the emotional driver when we're not feeling safe and we have an amygdala hijack. So your brain has two possible drivers, and which driver would you rather have driving your bus? I think probably 99% of the time we'd rather have the calm driver driving the bus, the prefrontal cortex. The labels of emotional driver and thinker driver are simply my nicknames. Neuroscientists would use the more scientific labels of default mode network for when the amygdala has hijacked the brain, or executive functioning for when the prefrontal cortex is in charge. So are there times that you actually want the emotional driver in charge? The answer is yes. Not very often, but yes, if you're truly physically in danger, you want the emotional driver in charge. Let's say you are actually being chased by lions and tigers and bears, and you actually are in danger. You sense the danger, you get an adrenaline rush, your body gets agitated. You truly don't have time to think. You need for the amygdala to hijack so that you can go into this fight, flight, or freeze mode. No access to rational thought because you just need to move on instinct. Does this happen very often in today's society? No. However, it could happen. If your toddler is about to run out into traffic, there is danger. And so you don't have time to calculate in a very thoughtful way, oh, that car is going 60 miles an hour and I think I can move so fast, and so with my calculation I've got 3.2 seconds to get there. It doesn't work. It's not an appropriate match of brain function to meet the demands of the situation. And really, anxiety management is making sure that the demands of the environment, the brain mode that you're in, match the demands of the environment. So if the demands of the environment are that you or someone else is not safe and you need fight, flight, or freeze in order to get safe again, and you need to move on instinct, then the mode of brain that you want is the emotional hijack. But most of life in our culture, we are not in physical danger. And so most of the time we want the prefrontal cortex to be driving the bus. That's the appropriate match for brain mode and situation. Here's another way of looking at brain function. Dr. Dan Siegel is a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine, and he uses his hand to demonstrate these two different modes of the brain. So when the hand is in the first position, like a fist, the thumb is tucked under the fingers. The thumb represents the amygdala, the emotional part of the brain, nestled deep inside the brain, and the fingers represent the prefrontal cortex, the area behind the forehead. So the first hand position represents when the prefrontal cortex is in charge, the wise brain mode. The second hand position represents when we sense danger and the amygdala hijacks, and he calls this flipping our lid. So we want to flip our lid if we're truly in danger, being chased by lions and tigers and bears, or the 2-year-old's about to run out into traffic. Otherwise, it's not helpful for us to flip our lid. We need the wise brain to stay in charge. The neuroscience research indicates that mindfulness meditation can help us to keep from flipping our lid when the situation really calls for us to remain in wise mind mode. Dr. Richard Davidson is a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison who studies the effect of mindfulness on the brain. In his book, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, he states that mindfulness meditation strengthens the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, so that when the amygdala starts to hijack, when we start to flip our lid, the prefrontal cortex can more easily calm the amygdala down so that we can stay in wise mind mode. So imagine a child about to throw a temper tantrum at the mall. The child will be more successfully soothed by an adult that he knows rather than an adult who is a stranger to him. A daily mindfulness practice is building the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So when the amygdala, like a child, threatens to throw a temper tantrum, the prefrontal cortex, like a wise adult, can more effectively soothe it. And here's another way to look at it. An untrained mind, one where the prefrontal cortex and amygdala have not built a daily relationship in meditation, that untrained mind is more likely to succumb to the spark of life events, turning into a raging forest fire of an amygdala hijack, a flipped lid. In contrast, meditation can train the mind, building a relationship, strengthening the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, so that if there is a life event which tries to spark the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex can dampen that fire before it gets out of control. I'm trying to use several metaphors, hoping that one of these will connect for you. Okay, so all of those slides were pretty much a long answer to the question, why does mindfulness matter? It matters because it's an evidence-based practice of how to open up a space between the events that happen to us and the behavior that we choose. And why does that matter? Because most of us yearn to be happy and yearn to not suffer. Events are inevitable. How we respond to events is optional. Mindfulness helps us to respond in ways that lead to less of that optional suffering. So mindfulness meditation helps us to be aware of our thoughts and emotions without judging them, helps us to see what's going on in our heads without getting carried away by it. And we all have this capacity. So I ask you this question. Would you be more likely to achieve a level of happiness with a mind full, 2 L's, F-U-L-L, of difficult thoughts and feelings? Or would you be more likely to achieve a level of happiness by mindfully interacting with the events, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of life? So, mindfulness is a way of being. Mindfulness with 2 L's, also known as mindless, is like having 500 dish channels, but somebody else has the remote control, and constantly switching channels, or staying on the same scary or enraging show. It's like a brain just filled with thoughts. My Buddhist friends call this monkey mind. Thoughts jumping all over the place. In contrast, mindfulness with 1 L is like having the possession of the remote control and training your mind to stay focused on one thing at a time in a calm and compassionate manner. I can say that I've lived both ways, and I have found much more peace with the second way, the mindful with 1 L, mindfulness way. So mindfulness is a way of being, and meditation is the way, one way to get there. So like being musically inclined can be a way of being, and practicing your instrument is the way you practice to get there. Mindfulness is a way of being, and meditation is one practice that can get you there. And it's like a muscle. It's built by repetitions. The bodybuilder knows that he has to do more than one repetition to get the muscle that he wants. Not only does he have to do more than one repetition, he has to do it on multiple days. Mindfulness meditation is like a mental gym. We're going to get more into that in the second presentation. But for now, think of it as focus on one thing, and usually that one thing is breath. It can be other things, and we'll talk about that later also. But you focus on breath, and then your thoughts wander, and you realize thoughts wandered, and you very gently, with no judgment, bring your focus back to the breath. And in 5 minutes of meditation, you might do that 50 times. And that's okay, because repetition is what will build the neural network in your brain that will strengthen the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So the mental gym, the practice that we're doing, that we're calling mindfulness meditation, is simply focusing on one thing like breath, realizing when your thoughts wander, bring the attention back to that one thing that you're focused on. I have a game at home that is called Othello, and on the side of the box, the motto of the game is, "Takes a minute to learn and a lifetime to master." And I think that could be the motto for mindfulness meditation. It really is so simple. It is focusing on one thing, and when the thoughts wander, you become aware the thoughts wandered, you gently bring the attention back with no judgment to whatever that one thing was that you were focusing on. It takes a minute to learn and a lifetime to master. And it will become more clear over time why that is such a helpful practice, But as we conclude this part of the presentation, let's just say that mindfulness meditation helps open up a space between the events that happen in our lives and the behavior that we choose. And so Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, was quoted as saying, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom." And I'll close with 3 of my favorite quotes by Mahatma Gandhi. "Your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny." And he also said, "You must be the change that you wish to see in the world." And for me, the final quote sums up why mindfulness meditation is so important to me. He said, "Happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony." Mindfulness meditation has been the tool that's helped me to be happier, because it's helped me to have more harmony, so that what I think and what I say and how I choose to behave are more often in line with who I want to be. And when I fail and am less than who I want to be, because that will always happen, nobody is perfect, but when it does happen, I am now more kind with myself, more compassionate with myself. So mindfulness meditation, one mantra that I've heard to describe it is being aware in the present moment with no judgment. So coming full circle back to the road rage incident that I mentioned, mindfulness meditation helps me to be aware of what's going on, be aware of the conclusions that I was jumping to, realizing that when I jumped to conclusions about that other driver, I really was the blind man hanging on to the tail, thinking that I knew the whole elephant. I will never know the whole story of why that driver chose to behave the way he did, but I also can have no judgment about it, still be annoyed, but not have the intensity of judgment. So I'm flooded less with the chemicals of anger, and I'm able to choose behavior that's in line with who I want to be. So that's all for this presentation. I hope that you will look at the next couple of presentations as well. Thank you.